So tonight, for everybody that's online, thank you for being here. This is an MS Views Now program. It is provided to you by MS Views and News. We are supported tonight by Sanofi and Sandoz, and we have our special guest. I know this special guest for quite a number of years. I know him when he was in a different role with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And I was so tickled, really tickled when he was appointed as the new president and CEO of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And this is Dr. Tim Cutsey. And you might have seen him on with me in the past. We had him on talking about many things to do with research and clinical trials in the past. And now we're here to talk about the global initiatives which the National Multiple Sclerosis Society is doing with leading research sites all around the world. So before I get into my questions, I want to ask Dr. Cutsey, please, to introduce himself.
Hey, Stuart, great to be with you. We can dispense with the doctor. We can just go with Tim,
Okay.
which is fine with me.
Great.
It's great to be with you and your audience. It's always an honor to be on the MS Views and News program, but also to be with your community. You're doing such great work in the MS community, and so grateful to be with you and happy to talk about whatever you and your community want to talk about.
Can you please tell us what exactly is the International Progressive MS Alliance?
Sure. Yeah. So the Progressive MS Alliance is one of the is an international organization that was started by the National MS Society and 5 of the international MS organizations, the MS societies in Canada, the UK, Australia, and Italy, along with the MS International Federation. And, the focus of the Progressive MS Alliance is, as it says, progressive MS. So, I'll divide my answer into a couple pieces. One is why progressive MS, and then more the international part, if you'll allow me. So the progressive MS part, back in the early 2010s, in that time frame, there was a lot of call for us to tackle the problem of progressive MS. At that point, we had a number of disease-modifying treatments for MS, which your community knows. But I heard, I was in a different role at the time. We had another CEO at the time. I heard quite loudly from the community that every time a new drug was approved for relapsing MS, the progressive MS community felt left behind, and that it just seemed that there wasn't enough focus, there wasn't enough attention to progressive MS. And so we responded to that by, first, bringing the scientific leaders from these MS organizations together to say, if we were going to tackle progressive MS, what are the gaps? What are the things we need to work on? Where are there funding challenges? And we laid out a blueprint for progressive MS that said, we need to tackle things such as what's the biology of progressive disease? What are the animal models? How do we tackle things like rehabilitation and symptom management and all of those pieces? But, as often happens, a strategy paper is only good as the actions that follow it. And so that's when the really important work happened in the Progressive MS Alliance, which was that these 5 MS organizations, we decided that we were going to raise money, pool our funds, and actually start funding research together as MS organizations focused on progressive MS. And today that may seem like, yeah, of course, why wouldn't you do that? A decade ago, organizations like ours each worked in our countries, but we didn't actually come together and share money, pool resources, do collaborative research together. And so over the last decade, the Progressive MS Alliance has really been focused on, elevating the profile of progressive MS and accelerating collaboration among researchers to tackle the problem of progressive MS. We've funded major collaborative research networks. We're funding a major program in rehabilitation research in progressive MS, and then also soon we'll be funding a program looking at clinical trials of progressive MS treatments to try to get some next generation treatments out there. So it's really come together. Now we've got, I think 10 or 15 organizations all working, MS societies working together. It is a model of international collaboration that I think we in the MS community can be totally proud of. And part of the international part of it, that stems, from the National MS Society's international commitment. When our founder Sylvia Lowry started this organization, she had an absolute commitment to going wherever we needed to go in the world to find the solutions to multiple sclerosis. And she started our movement, the MS Society, and really the MS movement internationally, when she placed an 11-word ad in the New York Times in 1945, and just 2 years later they funded their first research grants, two grants, one in the United States, one to a research group in the UK. And she believed to her death that didn't matter where the science was, let's go find it. And that's been something that the National MS Society has been proud to be part of. And we together are trying to inspire the world that we're stronger together when we share resources. So we're very proud of the Progressive MS Alliance. It's elevated the profile of progressive MS, and definitely something that I think we in the MS community can look at and say, this is what collaboration should look like.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Next one. What do you find to be? Can you share with us some of the recent advancements in the initiatives? I mean, big advancements. What have you? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a couple areas that I'm super excited about from the Progressive MS Alliance. We funded a collaborative research network that was led by Dr. Francisco Quintana. He's a researcher at Harvard, and he was very interested in understanding what is happening in the brain of people affected by progressive MS, and understanding are there different parts of the immune system that are involved in progressive MS. But beyond that, he was also interested in finding drug treatments that targeted those pathways that were involved in causing damage in progressive MS. So one of the things we did was we funded him to bring together a group of collaborators in Israel, Canada, I think in the UK and others, and they work together to try to tease out what are the biological pathways, what's going wrong in progressive MS, but then also if you can spot what's going wrong, then can you get drugs that prevent that from happening? And so they've identified a handful of drugs, and now they've actually narrowed that down to 2 or 3 that they're then taking through the next phases of testing that will soon get into people testing in clinical trials, which is what we want, right? It's not enough for the treatments to be in the lab. They need to get out of the lab and into people. So that's one initiative. Another major initiative is focused on what we call rehabilitation, and creating a pipeline for rehabilitation interventions in progressive MS. And this is a big important area, because we have known that we needed to have a 2-track strategy, which was solve the science that allowed us to find what's going on in progressive MS, get the drug treatments, potentially the myelin repair treatments, and get those in clinical trials. But the thing, and that's one thread, but the other reality that we know is that people with progressive MS need solutions today. And, drug development can take, 5, 10, 15 years. That's a slow, hard process. Are there things we can do today to improve life and make life better for people with progressive MS? And that's where things like rehabilitation, symptom management, and those kinds of things, which are quicker to get to people, need to be developed, so that people with progressive MS today can go to their doctor and the doctor can suggest different things. And so one of the challenges in rehabilitation research is that we don't have enough of it. Part of it is we don't have enough researchers focused on this area. And so we created a new program that basically, it's what we call our pipeline program, where what we did was we said we want, innovators to come forward with different ideas that to explore as potential interventions in rehabilitation of progressive MS. From an open competition, we picked 10 that we gave them some seed funding to get them started. And then depending on how they do with their seed funding, we then will fund some more to help them keep going and get the interventions developed and ultimately in clinical trials also for people with progressive MS. And that's another one of our major initiatives that we're really happy that's moving forward. What I would stress to your listeners, to the viewers and the listeners, is that our goal with the Alliance is not just to fund a program here or there, but to really come in with sustainable solutions that can actually be brought forward and that motivate the community to be able to make a difference in the lives of people with progressive MS.
Great, thank you very much. And before I ask the next question, I just want to tell all the new people that came online since we first opened up the program that if you have any questions, please click on the red rectangle at the top of the toolbar and click on it, type in your question, and I will get to your questions after I complete all of my questions. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And again, my name is Stuart Schlossman, and we are here with Dr. Cutsey from the National MS Society. My next question for you is, the Alliance currently supports 2 international drug discovery collaborative research networks, which bring the leading scientists together, I guess, from those different institutions. Can you tell us more about this, please?
Sure. So collaboration was a really important part of the Alliance, and one of the things we know is that science gets done faster when researchers are working together. And so we structure our programs so that, basically what we say is, we want you to work together. We also need you to bring your partners in multiple countries together. And that is, by doing that, we accelerate research. And, why I am confident in saying that is that, some years ago, the National MS Society had a program in myelin repair program that we basically took that approach where we said, we want you to bring collaborators together. It has to be at least 3 people working together, representing at least 2 countries. And that's just that was the rules. And that, you have to have a very specific goal orientation that by the end of the funding program, you're going to have X, Y, or Z. And it created, an environment that led to myelin repair strategies we see today. We learned from that, and that's what we did with the Progressive MS Alliance with these drug discovery networks. So one is led, like I said, by Dr. Francisco Quintana, which is, I said, focused on these treatments that are aiming to discover compounds that can protect the brain from damage and also turn off some of the immune system damage that's happening in the brain in progressive MS. The other program is based in Italy, but it's actually got 10 collaborators spread throughout Europe and the United States. And their focus has been on myelin repair treatments and neuroprotective treatments. So myelin repair are what they say. They are aiming to rebuild the brain, repair the damage in the nervous system. Neuroprotective drugs basically are treatments that a person would take that would actually act as a shield and help prevent nerve cells from basically dying in a person with MS and progressive MS. That's really important. Preventing cells from dying, nerve cells from dying, is super important because you can't put myelin back on a nerve cell that isn't there, and that's why neuroprotection, as we call it, is so important. And so the team is led by Dr. Gianvito Martino. He's in Milan at the San Rafael Institute, well known for his work in myelin repair strategies. And so they've been looking at drugs that have already been approved by the FDA and seeing if they can repurpose them for myelin repair and neuroprotection. They've identified a series of treatments that they then now are putting through their paces to see which ones might go into clinical trials for people with progressive MS. Again, focused primarily on myelin repair and some neuroprotection. This kind of collaborative research is exactly what what we like to do through the Alliance, and something we're quite proud of.
Good, thank you for that. So people are asking questions. I want to let everybody else know if you have a question to ask about uh, the National MS Society and the research that they're doing, this is the time to ask. Don't wait for somebody else to ask you a question. Just type it in. I'm not saying names or anything, so just type it in and we will ask the question. Okay, thank you. All right, so there are 9 projects that have been awarded funding to develop expert teams with the potential to develop, test, and implement novel therapeutic interventions. Can you please tell us what this is?
Sure. So those 9 teams are the part of the rehab repair program that I mentioned, that are focused on rehabilitation strategies. They're focused on addressing how to come up with new ways to tackle new interventions, whether it's through cognitive behavioral therapy, whether it's through exercise and cognition, that kind of piece. So that's one body of work. The other area that is working on is really looking at specific targets within the what's going wrong in progressive MS. We call those sort of the pathology, the understanding the mechanisms that drive progression. And your audience may be asking, like, so why are we don't we know what we need to know about progressive MS? And the reality is, the challenge we face is there's quite a bit about progressive MS and progression we still don't understand. We've become quite good in MS at managing relapses, preventing new lesions, and the like. But what has become very clear over the last few years, as your audience may know, you've heard terms like smoldering MS or progression independent of relapse activity, PIRA as it's called. What those terms are referring to is aspects of multiple sclerosis likely tied to progression that don't show up easily on an MRI, but which are going on in the person's body. And quite often people, the people with progressive MS notice it. I've spoken with individuals who will say to me, I haven't had a relapse in 10 years. I go to my doctor and they're like, they put that MRI in front of me and I don't have any new lesions and they tell me I'm good. And I know I'm not good because I don't walk as fast as I used to on the 25-foot timed walk, or I know that I'm not the person I was. I'm losing something. And that's what smoldering disease, PIRA, is about. And so we funded these projects to really try to get at, what's happening there. And can we understand some of that, the biology, using different animal models, studying different cell types, looking at different kinds of imaging technology to try to understand what is it about the biology that's happening in the biology of progressive MS. Because if you can understand that biology and those mechanisms that are, as the scientists will call them, the disease mechanisms, if you can understand what is causing those different pieces, you then can start to think through, well, what drug treatments could I use to intervene and stop that? And that's the key to developing new treatments, is you really do need to understand what's going wrong, and what are the aspects of the disease that are causing progression. So that's what we funded with that program. The projects were scattered throughout Europe, the United States, I think some in Canada. And the goal, as I said, is to really get a deeper understanding of progression and what's involved, so that we can then develop drug treatment targets against that.
So thank you for that explanation. It was very, very good. But did you just say that a person can have an MRI and it actually not show the new lesions, but they're smoldering and it is still getting worse, and their symptoms are getting worse, and they're feeling worse overall, but there's nothing clinically to show for it?
Not that can be seen with our technology of today. And that's the key aspect, is so that, we're limited by what the MRI can show you today. But one of the that's one of the reasons why we're focused on this, because one of the solutions to the problem that you're pointing to, Stuart, which is it's a frustrating problem people feel of like, I know I haven't had a new I spoke with somebody a couple weeks ago. I haven't had a I haven't had a relapse in 10 years. I haven't had a new lesion in 5 years. Doctor tells me I feel good. You should feel good, and I don't feel good because I just, I'm sure you've done the 25-foot time walk. You know that your time is slower than it was, and that is one of the aspects of MS that we know today that we've got to tackle, that we've got to address through Progressive MS Alliance. The way we solve for some of those things is by developing different kinds of MRI technology that can perhaps look deeper in different ways to spot what's going on in the brain. There's different there's different types of imaging, they call it, that sometimes in cancer there'll be this thing called PET imaging, which looks at where confines cancer cells real effectively. Well, PET imaging is just a tool and a technology, can be used in different ways as well in the brain. And the idea is, can we spot what might be going wrong in MS using PET imaging or different kinds of high-powered MRI? Or here's what I would love to see: it's a panel of biomarkers so that your doctor says, let's get you a blood test, and they'll look at 10 different markers and see what's going on. You and your audience, I'm sure, have heard about NFL, neurofilament light chain, which is a well-known biomarker that is being used by some. There are other molecules that could be indicators of damage in MS. And one of the things that I would love to see for our community is that we start actually thinking about tools like that, that we've seen in diseases like cancer, where they'll do 10 tests and say, okay, this gives you a score that tells you it's this or that. In medicine, they call that precision medicine. We don't have that in MS, but I think part of what we're doing in funding our research through the Progressive MS Alliance, but also through the National MS Society and other channels, is this idea of, can we get to those series of blood tests that could give the doctor the indication, okay, something's not right. Let's see about adjusting your medicine, trying this something else, because I can't see it with the MRI, but this blood test is telling me that something is going wrong. That's what we need. That's one of the things that as the society's CEO, I'm particularly interested in us driving towards.
Great, thank you for that. You were describing a patient before, and I said, that's me. I mean, that's exactly what I've been going through. I've been telling my doctor constantly that I'm slowing down. I can't think as well as I was. The processing time is ridiculous. My cognition's been horrible. We did another MRI, and he tells me you're stable. And I said, I'm smoldering. That's it. I'm smoldering. So you described it to a T, though. Yeah. So going forward about the Alliance, one of the unique things about the Alliance is that part of the Alliance is a team of people from around the world with progressive forms of MS, and they have a seat at the table. Can you tell us what they're actually bringing to this entire Alliance?
Sure. So, I mean, engaging people with lived experience about progressive MS has been part of what we wanted to do from the beginning. So, from the very earliest times, we had people with progressive MS who were part of the steering committee that led. Right. They had an equal seat at the table with the scientists. So we had 3 people. John Strum, who you may have had on your podcast, was one of those individuals, and they participated in the scientific decision making. They helped us really set our strategy and really kept us, grounded on why we were there. And then as we continue to evolve, we created what we call the People Affected by MS Engagement Coordination Team. And this is a group of volunteer leaders, all who are touched by progressive MS, all live with progressive MS at different stages of the disease from around the world. And that really is part of what makes the Alliance special is you got, 8 people spanning from Italy, Australia, Morocco, Canada, the US, And what they do is they not only have a seat at the table with our scientific strategy, they actually have a seat also in giving advice directly to the executive
Right.
committee, which is sort of the board of the Progressive MS Alliance. And the board, I am the chair of that board, so to speak. And so part of our, what we do is we want to hear what it means, what is the lived experience. But we also go beyond that. This coordination team developed, what we call the principles of patient engagement that laid out our vision for what it means for people affected by progressive MS to be engaged in the research process so that, they have a meaningful contribution. They can make a meaningful contribution to the work we're doing in improving the health and well-being of people with progressive MS. It's something that we're quite proud of, and the goal here is just to make sure that what in everything we do, we're grounding ourselves in the life experience of people with progressive MS.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I get into our next group of questions, I just want to ask you, can you tell everybody that's online and those that will listen later on, what the difference is between smoldering MS and pure?
So Tim Cootsy's opinion, they're different descriptors for the same thing.
Okay,
Basically, the idea that there is an ongoing disease activity in MS that we don't see through usual relapses, or that it may not be as obvious in the typical MS lesion. And so different research groups have come up with this terminology, but in effect, it's basically the same thing. That it's an ongoing disease activity that you don't necessarily see easily, that isn't necessarily targeted with the existing treatments that we have today, and that's one of the things that we do need to address is what's happening. We've made a lot of progress in MS with the more than 30 disease modifying treatments we have, but the way I've described it is we're at the 60-yard line. We're not anywhere near the finish line.
Great. Thank you for that. So a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2022 that you did the Pathways to Cures
Yep.
roadmap. I was thankful to be able to be invited to that. It was in Manhattan. You had researchers from around the world there. You had different MS organizations were all there from the United States and from outside. People that spoke in a language that I have no idea what they were talking about because it was all very clinical.
I
And
know
at
the
the
feeling
same time, when I asked a question in my MS layman language, those clinical researchers had no idea what I was talking about. So, can you tell us please about this Pathways to Cure roadmap and what the eventual outcome is intended to be?
Sure. Yeah, so Pathways to Cures is our vision, our blueprint for how we get to cures for MS. And I'm using cures in plural, in part because when we were creating the Pathways to Cures roadmap, and in the early days, we brought experts from around the world together before the meeting that you mentioned in New York to really center in on like what would we focus on if we were going to come up with a cure for MS? And so we came up with 3 pillars to the strategy. One of which would be to stop MS completely, stop progression. That would be a cure for some folks. Another pillar would be that we need to restore function, restore what's been lost from the disease, and that would also be for those living with the disease today a cure. And then the other pillar is ending MS forever through prevention. And so within that, we developed those 3 pillars: stop, restore, and end, as we call it. We had a vision for different, what would be different focus areas in each of those pillars. And we decided to publish that. And we published the first version in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal, I believe in 2020 or 2021. Then we redid it. No, we published it in 22 and then updated it. You came to the meeting that we had last year, and we just a couple of months ago published version 2 in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal again. And really what we have seen is that, you know, the ability for the community to say, okay, I can let me focus on this area or that area. And as you saw when we were together in New York, there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy in the community around being able to focus our efforts in these areas of highest need. And I'm really excited by the impact it's had for the community, but also people, you know, with MS and family members of those affected by MS can also then see the path for their loved one, for themselves, more clearly. One other thing I'll say is that this roadmap has been endorsed by more than 30 MS organizations from around the world, and so it has the collective power of our movement.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about something a little bit different here concerning research, and that is that how do you know that between what is found in one country, how does it connect to what's found in another country? How is it revealed or not? Because I've heard that, you know, with the laws, whether it be HIPAA laws from the United States or whatever laws from other countries, that people who are involved in these trials, that whatever concerns them is not being or not allowed to be discussed with others. So therefore, then, how do all these different research organizations share their knowledge to be able to link it together?
Yeah, so you put your finger on one of our biggest challenges, which is data. You know, there's sharing of data, but then there's also sharing of knowledge. So knowledge sharing is actually easier because researchers can get together in conferences like the one that you were at and can share learnings and insights, and that's much more practical. But to your point, like the sharing of clinical trial data, new research findings, those kinds of things are often there are firewalls and, you know, laws that get in the way of, you know, patient information moving from one part of the world to the other. And so one of the things we're working on is how can we lower some of those barriers to data sharing, lower some of the barriers to patient information moving back and forth. The scientific community is actually, interestingly enough, starting to think about, are there ways that we can actually share data with data not having to leave the country? And there's a concept called federated learning, as they call it. And basically the idea is you could have, say, data in Finland and the United States, say Brazil, and, you know, it could be hard to take all of that information in those different countries, put it in one place, but can we actually just leave the data where it is and actually find a way to network each other and create networks so that people are learning from each other without data moving? And so the researchers have seen the problem that you highlighted, Stuart, for us in New York, and developing their solutions around it. Part of the challenge, which I'll share for your audience, is, you know, the researchers do want to share the data. The problem is governments erect barriers, and, you know, some of it is well-intentioned, right? None of us want our privacy invaded. And the challenge in today's world, when you've got so many people who are bad actors who take data and use it against each other, you know, can do bad things with people's data. And so governments properly are trying to protect their citizens from being exposed and having their information manipulated in ways that's harmful. However, that has the consequence that when you're trying to do noble things like research with it, you know, it gets in the way of, you know, the patient being able to participate and contribute. So I'm optimistic, actually, that we'll be able to solve the problem of getting data shared together, based on some of what I've been hearing in the MS community. We're involved in trying to help facilitate some of that. So I think, you know, it's harder to change governments and harder to change laws, but I think, you know, our researchers are really creative and coming up with ways to work around some of those barriers.
Thanks. So I had asked that same question there in New York.
Yeah, you did.
And since then, I've come up with my own answer that I don't know. I would think that you all have figured that part out already. Why can't you use a cloud?
So,
If everybody's just putting their information up in the cloud
mhm.
under secured whatever, why can't that be used?
So interestingly, what I described the cloud model is a bit of what they're doing. There are nuances to what you're describing, that even the data moving out of the country into a cloud is got challenges with it. But what they figured out is, how do you create a cloud but also live within the laws of their country? And
Right.
I think people I think I think we're pretty close to it, to cracking that nut, actually. Um, which is
There's
exciting.
always Mars. There's always
Th-
Mars. There's always the
There's
moon.
always more. It's getting there. It's a little challenging, but yeah,
Could
I hear you.
be. It could be. Okay. Let's talk more about restoring loss.
Yeah,
We all have heard about, you can't repair the axons, or could you?
I don't see why you can't. So many, when I started working in the MS field a couple of years ago now, about 24 years ago, that the notion that you could repair myelin, yes, that was, people were like, no, no chance. Prominent doctors are like, there's no way you could do clinical trials for myelin repair today. That was a gap that we saw as a National MS Society, and actually addressed it with the program that I told you about, with these international research collaborations. And the practical thing is that there are now clinical trials happening of myelin repair treatments in MS. You do need to make sure that you're protecting the nerve cells, so you do need an axon, because myelin goes around axons, so you need to have the axon. But the good news is that if you have the axons, we also have the stem cells within our brains that can make the myelin making, that can produce the myelin making cells that can lay down new myelin. So the thing we know about the human body is that, and particularly the brain, is that remyelination can happen early on in MS. What There are a couple things that happen, though, that get in the way of remyelination happening. One is the aging process. As we get
Mhm.
older, our body does not repair itself as well. I'm sure, we all know that as you get older, you cut yourself, that cut heals slower. You come down with a cold, you recover slower when you're older. That is just part of the body's natural aging process, and that extends to the brain and the brain's ability to repair itself and remyelination. So the aging process is something that we need to tackle. And then the other piece is also preventing the inflammation and all of the damage, and stimulating those myelin making cells to do their thing. There is work that was done by Robin Franklin at University of Cambridge, who figured out that the brains of older individuals have just as many stem cells in them as younger individuals. The problem is the stem cells in the older individuals, and this is work they did from rats, just don't respond to all of the cues that tell a cell it's time to make new myelin. Those stem cells would just sit there, not do anything. And he figured out how he could try to rejuvenate those older stem cells and then get them to, think they're young again, which of course, who wouldn't want that? And so I think they've got, really insight that, could be applied in MS. And that actually becomes important because, people with MS are getting older every day. So that, with the aging process, if we could find a way to perhaps overcome some of that, that would be really important. There
That's
are
great.
myelin repair treatments in clinical trials today. So the short answer to the question is yes, we can do it. We need more people working on it, but it can be done.
I think, thank you for that. I remember, I think from the time I was diagnosed, I had heard about myelin repair um, trials already taking place, and I was diagnosed a little bit longer than you were now with the National MS Society. So you brought it up before. Can you tell us why you got involved with MS?
Sure. So my connection to MS is scientific. So I did not have a personal connection to MS. I was studying molecular biology, mRNA. Before anybody knew what mRNA was, everybody knows what mRNA is now. I was studying that. I was studying it in viruses and the like. But I had developed an interest in brain research. And so after I got my PhD, I did my postgraduate work in brain research, working at a lab funded by the MS Society. That's how I got introduced to MS. And then actually, ended up studying some questions about how myelin is made and how it's structured, and that got me plugged into MS research. So again, as a scientist, but then through that also got connected to the MS Society. I got engaged with the society. They funded my work, and then I joined the MS Society to actually have responsibility for the program that paid for my research when I was at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I'm proud to have been part of the community, and also proud to be able to be playing my part to end the disease.
That's fabulous. Thank you. On to the next subject. We're up to International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS.
Sure.
So could you explain this for everybody to know what this is about and what it does?
Sure. Yes. So the International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS, it's an international group of experts that are gathered by the National MS Society and ECTRIMS, the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS, the largest professional organization for MS researchers in the world. The committee, the Clinical Trials Committee, as we call it, the shorthand, has actually been in existence for more than 40 years. We created it back in the 80s, back when in the early days when they were just starting to test the first MS drugs. And back in those days, we didn't know a lot about doing clinical trial in MS drugs, how to do trials, when to use drugs, when to not use drugs. And so the society, as we normally do, saw a gap. My predecessors said, let's try to, help create guidance for the community on how to do clinical trials. And so some of the very earliest clinical trials were designed based on the input and feedback from this committee. Over the years, it's been very involved in a number of things. It's most well known for developing what we now call the McDonald diagnostic criteria. They're the tools that doctors use today for diagnosing MS. The very first of those were criteria introduced in 2001. It's been through four revisions. There'll be a fifth one coming out next year. And the criteria have had a really profound effect in terms of how we diagnose MS today. I'll give you a quick statistic. So in 2001, when the first diagnostic criteria were released, it took on average, and this is research from the New York State Consortium up here in New York, the average time that a person experienced from their first symptom to confirmed diagnosis was 4 years. And in those days, because that's an average, right? So imagine that's an average, 4 years. So that means some people were 8 years, some people were 2 years, so really wide ranging. The criteria really started to put in some better approaches, quicker diagnosis, so that now, if people use the 2017 criteria, the fourth edition of this, the average time to diagnosis from first symptom to confirmed diagnosis is down to 6 months, and some of that is even shorter. People could be diagnosed. I hear of people being diagnosed within a month sometimes. Still cases of people taking a long time to get diagnosed. So we've seen it is a verifiable that the speed with which people are being diagnosed has been influenced by the criteria, and this has been replicated throughout the world. Another thing that this committee is known for is, when we talk about MS, we talk about relapsing MS, progressive MS, and within progressive MS, there's secondary progressive MS, primary progressive MS. The term for those descriptions are the clinical course descriptors, as we call them. This way of describing MS was developed and introduced to the world by the Clinical Trials Committee. We're actually now in the process of updating those to try to get the descriptors to be more what the experience is of people with MS today. That's not easy work. You got to get international consensus on how to describe the disease. We were having a conversation about that earlier, right? Smoldering MS, PIRA, you have all this terminology. We're trying to get to a more biologically based description that doctors can use, but we're also being very careful about, this affects people. And so we want to be thoughtful about it. And then the other things the committee does is, we identify different gaps where we try to focus on, are there challenges where there are clearly neglected areas. So one of the neglected areas, not neglected, it's just the science hasn't kept pace, is aging in MS. Here's a statistic that'll perhaps be of interest to your audience. There are more people living with MS over the age of 55 than there are under the age of 55 in the United States.
Correct.
And that, so people are getting older with MS. And one of the things we haven't spent enough time on is understanding, how does MS change in an older person? Should an older person still be taking a disease-modifying therapy if they're taking a DMT? What does it mean to, what are considerations for diagnosing people over the age of 50? More and more people are being diagnosed at older age. And so that's also a tricky diagnosis. So we're addressing gaps in that. More recently, we did work in the area of women's health, another area that has not had enough attention in MS. And so we published some work around that. So it's an active group that we're very proud to sponsor.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, you opened up the doors for more of my questions, right? But firstly, I got to let you know that from my onset to diagnosis was 34 years.
Really?
That's crazy, huh? All right.
Well, that's
I was born too early. That's why.
We got to work on it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Let's talk about why first. I'm going to go backwards on this. On my questions that I was going to ask first through now or now through then. Why are there no clinical trials for people over 65? Especially now with the rate being so much higher of people over 55.
That is one of the issues. So we had a conference on this topic, on the topic of aging and MS earlier this year, and that is one of the issues that we're trying to tackle. There are not regulations that say you can't do clinical trials in people over the age of 65, and sometimes it's thrown up, well, the FDA this, the FDA that. No, that's not true. Oftentimes it comes down to, how is the disease showing up in the person that's 65 or older compared to, younger people? And I think this is one of the pieces that why we need to focus on some research in people over the age of 65, I should say over the age of 55, really, to be able to capture that, to really understand the disease. The barriers, oftentimes the barriers thrown up for participation of older individuals is, the people designing the trial aren't sure how to manage, those patients. They're not sure if the patient, the person over the age of 65, for example, is going to have, say, enough relapses in the duration of the trial in order to give them the answer to the question they need. It is an area, Stuart, that is unfortunately not studied enough, and that's really why we have such a gap. We
have to get the National MS Society to fix that.
Well, that's one of the reasons why the Clinical Trials Committee tackled that. And in fact, we have some recommendations that we make in a paper that we'll be publishing in the coming year about addressing that, because people with MS need to be involved in these trials, and they're being left out.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell me what is secondary progressive MS with no relapse?
So basically that is, in the way we describe it today, it's, just the steady loss of, function and in neurological function, as measured on the EDSS, as we call it, over time, without anything like, having new lesions show up, or having any of the, a very acute kind of like relapse, that you would have if you were having relapsing MS. It is, just that is the type of MS where when we talk about pura and smoldering disease, that's the type of MS that, if you were to use some of the more common terms, that's what's happening in SPMS. It's just the steady loss of, the hidden symptom, the hidden MS. The way I describe it is if MS were an iceberg, it's the MS that's underneath the water that's not being seen.
Okay, I know who did that one too. So Dr. Krieger. So,
Yes.
okay, so let's now back up to the most important question of all from this whole category you brought up, or I brought up, the McDonnell-Douglas criteria.
Mhm.
People hear about it. They don't know what it means.
Okay.
From the ground up, can you explain this?
Sure. So the McDonald diagnostic criteria, basically they lay out how a doctor should, you know, make a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis today. And, it involves whether or not a person has some sort of clinical symptom, like they're having visual symptom issues, they're having trouble walking, some sort of neurological symptom that is an indicator of MS. And then if that's paired with doing MRI to show whether or not there's new lesions, then within that there's an algorithm that a doctor will follow that said, okay, you've had two events over here, two neurological events, plus you have a lesion, one or more lesions in this area. That tells me you have MS. The McDonald criteria, lay out very specifically how many lesions, where to look, the timing of events, and the like. We have over the years, added new things for making a much more precise diagnosis of MS. And in the coming year, about a year ago now, we had a consensus conference that explored, how we should revise the diagnostic criteria now for the fifth edition, as we call them. And what the fifth edition will do is it still keeps the core structure. If a person shows up with symptoms consistent with clinical symptoms, they go to a neurologist because they're having trouble seeing, they're having trouble walking, or something that's consistent with MS. The doctor will still need to do an MRI, take a look at what's happening in there. But what we've added is new refinements that let a doctor get even more precise and be faster about diagnosing the disease. And so we've given the doctor some new tools of new ways to do new types of imaging that will let them spot whether or not the lesions in the brain really are lesions for MS, because not every lesion in a brain necessarily is MS. Humans are complicated, and you put a person in MRI, you could have a white spot. It might be MS, it might not be MS. So we provided some additional guidance about if it's an ambiguous case, here's what to look for. We've given additional guidance as to how to handle cases like diagnosing MS in an older person, diagnosing pediatric MS, diagnosing in situations where individuals who have a migraine and headache, sometimes it can make things complicated in terms of diagnosing MS. The goal of the revised criteria is to accelerate diagnosis, to get it down from 34 years to maybe months, and also to help doctors make a more precise diagnosis. Because what we want is people to be accurately diagnosed as either having MS or not having MS, and if they have MS, getting them on a disease-modifying treatment as quickly as possible. That's the goal. So we're hoping to have the updated criteria, which still basically are anchored in the same foundation, which is clinical symptoms plus MRI, which you would then use to make a diagnosis. But it's the community is really eager to get these underway so that people can be diagnosed faster. The community wants people to be diagnosed correctly. They want them to be diagnosed quickly.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now, when you're talking about all this criteria going out, is this only going out to MS neurologists around the country, or are doctors in general learning about this as well and what to look for with their
Sure.
patients?
So, the new criteria will be published next year. So at this point, I don't have any, we're not doing any, overt communication with the community because we need to have them in a peer-reviewed journal before we do anything. It needs to stand, they need to go through the rigors of evaluation. But when they are published, as you described, so definitely MS specialists, they'll get them through all the conferences and all the different places. But we, the National MS Society, ECTRIMS, and others, are very also committed to making sure that more than just the MS specialists have this and see it. Many people with MS are first seen by a general neurologist. They're not seen by an MS specialist, or they may live in a community that doesn't have any neurologists. And so we're working to make sure that other health professionals also have access to this, whether it's general practitioners, family practice groups, optometrists. I mean, when people go get their glasses, oftentimes that's sometimes where people with MS, that first experience will be they go to an optometrist, get new glasses, and the doctor says, "There's something going on in your eye. Maybe we should get you to a neurologist." And I mean, I was getting new glasses, a couple years ago, and that's what the optometrist said to me, when they heard where I worked. So our goal is to get this as widely disseminated as possible. What I want to see is that, the future I would hope we could have is that a person who's having that neurological symptom goes in to see they go to see the doctor gets them in, and the doctor has enough awareness of multiple sclerosis that they're like, maybe we should get you to a neurologist to address this, rather than, this person sort of being, marginalized because the doctor doesn't quite know what they're seeing. So that's our goal.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm not going to ask you any more questions from my questions because we have so many questions online that we got a good half hour of questions here, right? But
Outstanding.
before I get into all of that, I do want to say thank you for what you have spoken about, because I know that this is quite needed for so many to hear, and I'm glad for those that are online that can share this and tell your friends what they missed by not being there, or your family what they missed by not being there. But we will be putting this onto our YouTube channel eventually, I will say, and hopefully quicker, especially with this one than others, but it will be there. I'm just extremely far behind. All right, so
I feel your pain.
It's hard when you're doing all the traveling in those deserts that you talk about, those neuro deserts out there, that we bring our programs there for people to be able to have access and learn something about MS. All right, so we have a lot of questions from people about CAR T cell therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And you made a comparison earlier. You were talking about the PET scan with cancer. Can you tell us how CAR T developed and where we're looking to go with it in the MS community?
Sure. Yeah. So CAR T is a new type of immune therapy where basically they take, the doctors take immune cells out of a person, they engineer them to then they initially were developed in cancer to basically get immune cells to target cancer cells specifically. And the idea is you basically turn these immune cells into a smart bomb that basically goes, finds a cancer, destroys it very specifically. An incredible innovation and technology. And I think as more and more of these treatments come out, it could really be, transformational for oncology is one area. But there now has also been thinking that there's a way to do that also in MS and other immune therapies. And the idea is, again, similar, where, the idea is you take the cells out, you engineer them to do a couple of things. One is maybe you get immune cells to go after the bad actors in MS that are the bad, because not all immune cells are bad. But it turns out in MS, there are some ones that are misbehaving very specifically. And the idea is, could you engineer, these cells to be able to instead of, basically target those T and B cells that are misbehaving in MS and stop them from doing their taking damaging action against the brain. There's also other types of CAR T variants that are focused on what we call regulating the immune system. So instead of going in and destroying cells, they're actually, they act as a bit of like a master regulator. The way to think about it would be like the thermostat in your house. You turn that thermostat down, it gets colder or hotter depending on, or up, it gets hotter. And the idea is that, with these CAR T, you basically turn the thermostat one way or the other. And the idea with the thermostat here would be just turn those immune cells off. So it's a really exciting opportunity. It's very tailored, so it's tailored to the person. So that's one of the things that makes it a little bit of a challenge, because when you're trying to do that on a large scale, it requires, quite a bit of specialization. But I'm intrigued by what might be possible. There's some companies that are doing some innovative work in that area, and it's just another great example of how, when you invest in science in different areas, insights come that you wouldn't expect, and they surprise you. CAR T is definitely one of those. So it's an exciting thing that, again, came out of very basic research into how the immune system works, and it's a great example of why it's so important that, institutions like the National Institutes of Health continue to fund researchers who are just sort of seeking to try to understand how our bodies work, because it's in those kinds of research that you just make the discoveries that you just weren't expecting. And so the scientist in me is like, we've got to keep doing that, because you just never know what might turn out to be a cure.
Quite true. Thank you for that. And MS Views and News will be doing or helping to promote many clinical trials coming up in CAR T therapy. So stay tuned, everybody. You're going to be getting swamped with emails about CAR Ts going forward. Dr. Coetzee, if you have to cut off at any time, you just let me know, all right?
I'm good. I'm good till 8:30.
Okay, great. All right. A person is asking, how will the National MS Society support rural communities? For example, I live in a rural community where there is no MS Society presence, and another person writes that they live in an area similar to this, but that there are no MS centers anywhere around either.
Yeah. So I can so for the first one, that's one of the things that I'm working on with our leadership team, is how do we get out into the communities. Obviously, the United States is a big country, so we're trying to figure out how we can reach as many people as we can. This is one of the reasons why we have more online programming, because we try to get to places, but we are working to try to get into communities and to really get connected with people where they are. The second question about MS centers, that is something that we actually have just finished up. Stuart alluded to it. We have had a sense that there are many parts of the United States where there aren't people who don't have access to any MS specialists. Some don't even have access to doctors for hours. And so with the help of some partners, we actually did a very fine mapping of where are the MS centers in the United States, where are the neurologists, where are the MS specialists, and overlaid that against where we know from both our database as the National MS Society, but also some research we funded, where are people affected by MS living in the United States, at least in terms of the numbers we know from prevalence studies. And we found that there are a number of places that there are what we call neurological deserts, which sounds like you are in, and that's defined as having to drive more than 25 miles to get to a doctor in different areas. And one of the things we've done, now that we've mapped this, we're getting ready to publish this data. We're starting to advocate to address those needs in different parts of the country, and then what we're doing, our team that is focused on this, is we've identified 3 states. I know you'll probably ask me which of the states. Unfortunately, I'm not remembering which they are at this point, but we've identified 3 areas in the United States that have these neurological deserts that we're going to focus in on to figure out what are the kinds of interventions that work. And one of the things we know is that, a health system, like getting an MS center is more than having a doctor in a center, right? You need an MRI, you need a hospital system. If they're going to prescribe any of the drugs that are infused, you need an infusion suite. So there's a lot of infrastructure that goes with having an MS center. It takes more than a doctor. And so we're trying to figure out what are the incentives, what are the things that get in the way of having all of those things. Because if one of the hard lessons we learned when we try to help motivate doctors, MS specialists to go to particularly rural communities is, they would train at a top-notch MS center, they go back to their community, they try to deliver MS care. They just bumped into all the barriers that I mentioned. The hospital system wouldn't support them. They didn't have the MRIs. They couldn't prescribe the treatments people wanted. People, couldn't get to them. And so then they end up leaving and going back to somewhere else where they can practice medicine. So we're trying to crack that nut. This is going to take some time, but it'll be a combination of focused efforts, but also advocacy at the state and federal level, which is super important.
Well, I hope you're not, if you're planning on going to Wyoming, which I could definitely see as one of those deserts, you better bring stirrups with you as well.
There's stirrups. We'll go where we need to.
Yes. All
Get
right.
me
Next,
on a horse. Right? Are you telling me that I got to get on a horse, Stuart?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That sounds good.
All right. So next, a person writes, if there are more people now over 55 with MS, and there are more women diagnosed with MS, why is hormone therapy not on the list for over 40 medicines approved for not 40, but in the list of many medicines approved for symptomatic treatment of MS?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the areas. Part of it is that there's not been as much research on the hormone therapy in MS specifically and studying that. So there has been work done in that area. I will say that, and where it is one of the areas that we explored in our conference to try to understand that. The knowledge, our understanding of that area is not as deep as one would think. Again, in the context of MS, hormone therapy has been studied in a lot of different contexts, and that is true. But in the context of MS, unfortunately, not as deeply studied as one would think. And this is one of those areas that we want to try to tackle and get a deeper understanding. There has been some work, but it is definitely one of those areas that we just know that we have to do more work in.
Sure, thank you for that. And most people hear about hormone therapy for women, but it's also been discussed at many of our events that testosterone therapy, even for men, happens to increase your cognitive abilities, or you have less fatigue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been some work done by Dr. Voskel in Los Angeles. She did some clinical trials, and so certainly there's been some evidence pointing to that, and I think there's just some more work that needs to be done in that area.
Okay, great, thank you. A person wrote something that I got to give you all kudos about. National MS Society made it possible for me to travel from a current medical desert back to a major city with multiple sclerosis centers with grants to assist travel. Thank you. She says. I don't know if it's a he or a she, and I'm not going to say so.
You're very welcome.
Okay. All right. Next, we have a person asking about EVB. If EVB is part of the MS process, EBV creates several antibodies, and one of them look for myelin-looking cells. Can you explain this?
Yes. So I think ABV, Epstein-Barr virus, as it's known, the virus that causes mono and some cancers, has been associated as a potential trigger for MS. And there are some doctors who believe that, it is the trigger for multiple sclerosis. Jury's, in my mind, still a little bit out on that. But there is enough data now to point that EBV potentially could act as a trigger if there's a combination of other factors. So there's two things that there's some active interest in. One is, is EBV infection something that makes MS disease activity worse? And there's some work being done to see whether or not, antiviral treatments, drug treatments that target EBV could potentially have an effect on MS disease activity. So that's one thing we're trying. Then a separate body of work really relates to EBV and preventing EBV infection. And by preventing EBV infection, do you then prevent the development of multiple sclerosis later in life? That's a more complicated question because it involves getting a vaccine strategy, then trying to figure out when do you vaccinate someone for potentially preventing the onset of EBV. But there is some we have actually gathered experts to think about how one would do that, clinical trial, because it would be a long-term clinical trial, over decades, and how would you do that? But we actually have a group of experts that have come up with an idea and a concept and a plan. We're planning on publishing that in a journal sometime, probably either later this year or early next year, and then that'll help guide how the community tackles this question. It's something that it's more than just designing the clinical trial. You actually, one of the things we've learned about vaccines is you want to develop a vaccine, you need a factory, you need a whole bunch of infrastructure to get it done. But the good news is that COVID actually identified a new way to develop vaccines that I think the community had not previously appreciated. And so Moderna, a few others are developing mRNA vaccines against EBV, which may actually be easier to make than some of the more conventional strategies that were considered. So a possible silver lining from COVID is that we may have some, new vaccine strategies to consider in MS.
Great, thank you.
You would not have heard me saying that 3 years ago, but may as well take our advantages.
That's right. Heard in the news lately was about the Hercules trial.
Yes. Hercules. Yes.
Can you tell us about it, please?
Yes. So this was a trial of a BTK inhibitor, so Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So this is a molecule that's involved in some of the B cells and different immune cells involved in MS. Hercules looked at whether or not the drug tolobrutinib could prevent progression, slow down progression in people with inactive secondary progressive MS, as we talked about earlier. And the good news is that yes, tolobrutinib did have an effect. It slowed down progression by about 30% in the secondary progressive MS patients. This is really quite exciting. It's it's the first drug tested in specifically in secondary progressive MS, specifically in these patients. And so I was actually at the conference where this was presented and was really quite excited that we might be on the cusp of our first treatment for secondary progressive MS. Very exciting.
Very exciting. Thank you. HSCT.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell the world what is happening with this?
Sure. So hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, it's a way that in some situations individuals will have some of their bone marrow stem cells taken out, and then after they go through some chemotherapy treatment, their own cells are put back into their bone marrow, and basically it's a way of resetting the immune system, and by resetting it in that way, it drives down the active inflammatory activity that's associated with particularly relapsing MS. There are more. We and there were the bone marrow transplantation community have published guidelines on how to what people with MS should consider within HSCT. There are more centers within the United States that are starting to do HSCT therapy as an option for particularly cases where it's typically been recommended and where our medical experts feel it is appropriate is in those situations where a person is not responding to any of the existing treatments that are out there, and that, whichever treatment is tried, their disease is so active, it definitely, they should consider this as an option. It's not recommended at this point for people with more progressive MS that don't have inflammatory activity. The data doesn't seem to support that it's an effective treatment at that stage of the disease. And one of the barriers that we're again working to try to help people overcome is you need a neurologist, you need a bone marrow transplantation team, and you need a series of things to be in place in order to have the HSCT. But there are more centers that are doing it. We're also provide guidance on our website if people are looking to get insurance appeals, because not all insurance will approve this. And so we have tools available for people if they're trying to appeal with their insurance company to carry it.
Thank you for all that. Is there a list somewhere where these centers now are, now that you're speaking about this?
Yeah, so if you go to the Society's website and look under HSCT, you can actually go to, they call them the FACT certified. There's actually a whole certification system for centers that will do these, will do HSCT. I think one of the things I'd encourage your audience to really be mindful of is that, it's not just about having a neurologist that's prepared to do it. Oftentimes the centers that do it are associated with oncology centers where bone marrow transplants are done more routinely. And sometimes those centers won't do them because they don't, for different reasons, don't want to take that case on. So it's still a little bit of a patchwork sometimes in terms of doing that. And so encourage your audience to really look at centers. Places like Cleveland Clinic, I know, are doing it more frequently. And so I think those would be what I'd take a look at.
Great to hear. It's finally happening, right?
Yep. Step by step.
Okay, thank you. Also, two other topics that are brought up all the time, and that is B cell therapy and T cells. So can you tell us about each and the differences?
Sure. So T cells and B cells are, the core. They are the cells that are the major immune cells that help us fight off infections and a variety of different things. Both of them turn out to also, in MS, can have damaging effects on the nervous system. The T cells, they will attack the myelin-making cells. They're very good at targeting things like infections, and also in the brain, the myelin-making cells, when they're sort of turned on and stimulated to attack myelin. Treatments like Gilenya, Tecfidera, some of our general MS treatments target them and basically slow down their disease activity. The B cells are also involved in the immune system. They're the ones that make, when we talk about antibodies, B cells are the ones that make antibodies. And in MS, what's happening is you have some B cells that are stimulated to make antibodies that destroy myelin-making cells, typically called the anti-CD20. And there are actually some treatments that very specifically target the B cells. They're the treatments that will be known as Ocrevus, as well as Kesimpta, Briumvi. They are very targeted at those B cells and eliminating those B cells. The challenge about eliminating those B cells is that they also they eliminate the B cells that are involved in MS, but they eliminate the B cells that are involved in developing antibodies and immunity against other things that you might be infected against. And so that's the balancing act that, when doctors are talking about a person's B cell levels, that's the tricky part. I mean, we do want to have some B cells in our body to fight off some of those other things that are causing infections and disease in MS. So the tolebrutinib that I talked about, the BTK inhibitors, they also target the B cells. They target very specific B cells as well as other cells. So B cell therapy and T cell therapy are both important. They're part of the toolbox that a neurologist would use in a person.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, next, we're getting down to the end here. First one is the first one is talking about that some doctors are saying how the blood test for the serum neurofilament light and the neurofilament light by itself, whatever, and the now coming about octave test that they may one day replace MRI. Do you feel this way or not?
Um, I can't, I wish I had a crystal ball. So, and my answer is, I don't know. Here's what I do know. They're not, a blood test is not replacing MRI anytime soon. What will have to happen for for a blood test to replace MRI is there to be a very clear demonstration that the blood test tells you exactly the same thing as the MRI, and that, they're interchangeable. We don't have any data today to show that these two things are interchangeable with each other, and I think it'll take some time for the research community and people to develop the data that will say that the MRI and the blood test are completely interchangeable. I'll say to your audience, I'd love a day where a doctor can prescribe a blood test that gives them a quick panel read on what's going on in a person living with the disease, because that sure will be a lot less expensive than a $4,000 MRI. So and less hassle for a person, quicker to do, all of those things. Our insurance companies won't, it'll be just easier all the way around. But to get to that state, what we have to do is we've got to do a lot more work to understand which of those biomarkers like NFL that could tell you paint the whole picture of the disease, and really demonstrate in thousands and thousands of patients that blood test is the same thing as getting an MRI. We're not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Tim Coetzee, the new CEO president of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. I feel so much better about the society now than I have ever before, because I know that there is now a gentleman in the position that is scientifically involved, as well as he's there with brains and brawn, everybody. So we're looking to see great things come from this, and I hope to be able to do this with you again in the near future.
Always a pleasure, Stuart. It's an honor to be with you in the MS News and Views community. So, or Views and News community. I always transpose
right.
the MS Views
That's
and
right.
News community. So, thank you.
Right.
You're very kind.
Right.
Honored to be here. Honored to be with you and to spend some time with you and your community. Again,
Have a
thank
great
you
night.
again. A pleasure. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.